Hello, my name's Nick and I'm a researcher at the University of Birmingham's Department of Engineering. My research brings together two worlds which you might imagine to be quite separate, but in fact are very closely intertwined. The first world is nuts and bolts of the engineering world, the railway network. This world we want to be ultra safe, ultra reliable and inexpensive. We want our trains to arrive on time to get us to college, school or work on time, and we want a nice, smooth, uninterrupted journey. Okay, we know we don't always get this. We also know that modern rail travel is an efficient and climate-friendly form of transport, and so it's an important aspect of our future transport networks. The second world is that of the rest of the animal and plant kingdoms. This world also needs to be able to reach out beyond its home territory for various reasons, such as environmental pressures to relocate due to our climate change, during annual migrations, and also to maintain healthy populations by sharing genes with other groups in the same species. Animals and plants also need to interact with each other, from the microscopic organisms in the soil to huge trees and all in between. These living systems are known as ecosystems, and each organism plays its role within the ecosystem. A habitat with many types of organism is known as biodiverse, and we now recognise the importance of biodiversity in the natural world. Biodiversity sits alongside climate change as key issues for the 21st century. So the two worlds of railways and nature come together on transportation corridors. Now, from the eyes of an asset manager who's working for a railway company and thinking about operations, huge luxuriant trees swaying in the breeze and bushes full of wildlife of all shapes and sizes all amounts to one thing: hazards. For example, we have the risk of trees or branches falling onto the line or even onto trains. The infamous leaves on the line, which can cause big delays to services. And also we have collisions with wildlife. So why do we need to make way for trees and animals anyway, when there's plenty of green spaces elsewhere outside the cities and conurbations? And how do we operate a safe and efficient railway but still leave room for the natural world? Let's take a closer look. First question is about the amount of green land in the UK. Well, from the perspective of native plants and animals, not all green space is good space. This map's a high-level summary of land cover in the UK. Each colour in the key represents a broad habitat type from an ecological point of view and was produced from satellite images using artificial intelligence and other mapping processes. Each habitat type is a world in itself for various life forms occupying it, and each of its life forms contribute in various ways to the functioning of the whole ecosystem. Animal and plant populations have very specific needs in terms of habitat. So we'll take a look at various types of habitat. I'll use figures for England, but similar statistics are available for other parts of the UK. So first, let's look at the human element. The panel on the left tells us that over 2/3 of England is designated as agricultural land. Roughly half of this is for crops, and the other half is permanent grassland, which is predominantly used for grazing of livestock. Most of the crops grown in the UK are cereals. Oilseeds, vegetables and fruits make up the remainder. So combined with villages, towns and cities, a hefty portion of England is currently used for either to house or feed humans. Let's look in more detail how England can be subdivided in terms of land use in order of total cover. Grassland accounts for the largest portion of land cover. About a third of this is improved grassland, which has regular fertiliser and herbicide treatment. The remainder are semi-natural grasslands, and much of this land is grazed. Combined with this is the land used for arable and horticultural use, which together make up 69% of total land area. Woodland accounts for about 12% of land cover. About 2% is coniferous and the rest is broadleaf or mixed. We'll come back to this in the next slide. The built environment accounts for about 7% of land cover, although Natural England think that this might be underreported using their current methods. The remaining land area is a mixture of agriculturally unproductive land, but distinct natural environments in themselves. Okay, we've seen that the UK is a mosaic of habitat types. Let's take as an example the deciduous woodland habitat type, which is about 10% of land cover, and see how these habitats are distributed across the landscape. We can see from the large-scale map in the background that deciduous woodlands are dotted across the landscape in relatively small patches. This example shows Manchester at the top left out towards New Mills, and I chose this slide because it goes from where I was born to where I live now. If we take a closer look at the inset, we can see that the deciduous woodlands appear in patches of habitat, and what's interesting in this example is that the railway between Marple and New Mills runs through these habitat patches like a backbone, and we'll come back to this observation later. So what's the problem? We have lots of woodland in the area, and all we need to do is conserve what exists, and our woodland communities will thrive? Well, it's not quite that simple. There are a number of pressures acting on animals and plant populations, which demand that they are mobile and that they're able to extend beyond their habitat patch. If the land is too hostile between patches, they won't be able to achieve this. So first, a few terms which will help explain the problems of connectivity. Dispersal is where the organism relocates from its home range to new sites. This is part of the life history of every species, and it helps reduce competition to respond to environmental change and also to breed with other populations, which creates a healthy genetic mix. Habitats which are enclosed by hostile or unsupportive environment can be cut off from dispersal beyond the patch. Migrations are return journeys to other locations, for example for breeding or overwintering, and diffusion is expansion of the range of a species over many generations. A good example of this is population shifts in response to our rapidly changing climate. The big challenge is whether the species is able to secure suitable habitats faster than the pace of climate change. Inhospitable regions between habitat patches will slow this process down. There are lots of ways organisms have evolved to disperse, and these can be broadly grouped into active and passive dispersal. Active dispersal involves self-propulsion, for example by flying or walking. Passive dispersal uses an outside force such as wind, water, or other animals. So for an organism to extend its range, it'll need to be able to travel to a new area, survive the passage, and also increase its numbers on arrival. For particularly long moves, breeding in between patches may also be required. So when an organism encounters an environment which is unlike its native habitat, this is known as a barrier. The ability of the barrier to prevent further progress depends on both the new environment as well as the physical characteristics of the organism itself. For instance, a frog moving from one pond to another will need to move through a moist environment to prevent drying out, or the second pond must be very close by. A dispersal corridor is strictly speaking a route from one place to another, such that the ecological community is able to relocate in its entirety. This would need the corridor to be pretty much similar in composition to the habitat patches. A filter is more restrictive than a corridor and may allow some organisms to disperse but prevent others. This is an interesting question for my research when looking at vegetation along railway corridors, where I'm looking at the ability to disperse along the railway corridor as well as from one side to the other. So as you remember earlier, I mentioned the railway line in this image runs through lots of woodland habitat patches on its way to new mills. Well, this relates to my first research question, which is which parts of the railway network can contribute most to ecological connectivity. Clearly this would be a major task if we were to do this manually for each section of the railway in the UK. But luckily, the past decade or so has seen a massive increase in the availability of information, computing power and technology needed to automate the process. The engine for this is known as Geographic Information Systems, or GIS for short. GIS gives us the ability to combine maps such as satellite images with other location-specific information like temperature, elevation, rainfall, or animal sightings. We can then use calculation tools to build into the GIS software to ask questions such as which woodland patches are less than 500 metres away from the railway line. A specialised field known as corridor modelling has evolved in recent years to address the challenge of habitat connectivity. And this approach looks at the suitability of the landscape for movement by an organism or a group of organisms. By combining information such as the ground profile, distance from water and the types of vegetation cover, a map's generated which plots how easy it is to move across the region. This is known as a cost surface, and the higher the cost, the more difficult it is to cross each location. Corridor modelling essentially calculates the least total cost route for travelling from A to B. So using the map above, suppose we want to find the best corridor to connect habitats for a given woodland species found near Marple, New Mills and Hayfield. We'd use information from the habitat map, which is the map below, and combine this with other species-specific requirements to arrive at a cost for each pixel. The route with the lowest total cost or within given bounds will reveal our best dispersal corridor. Clearly, woodland locations will provide an environment similar to native habitats, or other habitat types could either help or hinder movement. So we can see that in this case, the railway between Marple and New Mills could potentially provide a continuous corridor for dispersal of our chosen woodland species, and the generous woodland cover in the Set Valley helps to connect New Mills to Hayfield. Other areas along the railway network might offer differing levels of habitat connectivity. So using this approach, we're able to rank the rail corridor for its potential to support dispersal and to plan our management of the trackside vegetation accordingly. Once we determine the potential for the rail corridor to support connectivity, we can focus on the areas of high potential for special consideration. It should be remembered that there are many habitat types and each will generate its own profile of potential along the rail corridor. Areas of overall low potential tell us that we can focus our spending here on operational issues and adopt a standard approach to vegetation management. However, we need to bear in mind that habitats are changing in response to climate change and land use changes, so this prioritisation may change in future years. So once we've identified a section of railway which has potential as a dispersal corridor, the next question is how do we assess the current vegetation quality in its role as a dispersal corridor? Well, the first step is to work out what you have on the ground, and in asset management terms this is called an inventory. As you can imagine, if this was carried out by visiting the location and walking the length of the route, it would be very tedious and time consuming, not to mention a safety concern on the railway. However, there is another way. You may have heard in the news recently about the rise of artificial intelligence and more specifically machine learning, Whatever your views on this and how this is shaping society, in the field of GIS and mapping, it has huge potential. In my case, I'll be looking at how machine learning can be used to recognise different types of vegetation and to create a map of tree characteristics along the rail corridor, such as position, height, volume, species, and potentially the health. There have also been machine learning models produced which can identify ash trees using a car-mounted camera. This has been used to help the Highways Agency to assess the risk of ash dieback along UK roads. This disease can lead to branches or sometimes whole trees falling and causing injury or damage. So clearly having a database of the locations of ash trees can be very useful for an asset manager, who can then plan for regular inspections. In a similar way, using machine learning to recognise vegetation types from images or video, another objective of my research is to map the various types of vegetation along the railway in high potential areas. I'll be using this to measure current corridor quality, and from this we can select areas for improvement which can increase the overall corridor quality most effectively. Improvements will be tested and quantified using corridor modelling software. We can also use our GIS database to plan inspections of old or large trees, or to record actions against specific trees such as cutting back branches or full removal in the case of severe tree disease. This database of natural assets can help us to value our line-side vegetation and to manage it alongside other railway infrastructure. So the final part of my research will be to consider how to incorporate this methodology into the operational planning and risk management, maybe even towards specifying a software tool for decision making. The basic premise of this will be that the natural system is one amongst many interconnected systems on the railway network. We have signalling systems which interface with track systems. We have overhead line systems conveying trains which are fed by power systems. The built environment such as bridges, platforms, cuttings and embankments manage the interface with people and the wider environment. For example, tree cover mustn't be allowed to obscure signals up to a certain sighting distance. Tall trees close to the line require careful management due to tree fall risk, blocking the route or bringing down overhead line. Additional vegetation cover to improve corridor quality might be accompanied by an increase in the risk of animal collisions in the area, which might raise a need for under-track crossing points or audible alarms when the trains are approaching. So by considering how trackside vegetation and its inhabitants impact and are in turn impacted by other railway systems, we can develop vegetation management practices which strike the optimal balance between the needs of human societies and nature. So that about sums up my research at the University of Birmingham, and I hope it will contribute towards finding ways to live alongside nature and to support building networks to improve biodiversity in the UK and beyond. So thank you very much for your time. Goodbye.